Hey everyone, it's Lauren back with episode 4 of the Depolarizers podcast, where we talk to those who are effectively working to depolarize American politics. In today's episode, we have Didi Kuo, a Center Fellow at the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law at Stanford University. Didi makes the case that we should have stronger parties and embrace partisanship, just not embrace polarization. Thanks for joining, and let's get into it. Didi Kuo is a Center Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University. Her research includes democratization, political parties, state building, and the political economy of representation. At Stanford's Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, she oversees the program on American democracy in comparative perspective, which seeks to bridge academic and policy research on American democracy. She's the author of The Great Retreat: How Political Parties Should Behave and Why They Don't, and Clientelism, Capitalism, and Democracy: The Rise of Programmatic Politics in the United States and Britain. Her work has been published in academic journals such as the Comparative Politics, Comparative Political Studies, and Perspectives on Politics, as well as the Washington Post, Democracy Journal, and Vox. Didi, thank you so much for being here and excited about our conversation today.
Me too. Thank you so much for having me, Lauren.
Of course. So I wanted to start out with something that I think is one of your favorite topics. I don't want to assume, but the history of partisanship and the role it's played in structuring / building / contributing to democracy, because I feel like a lot of people feel like partisanship is bad for democracy, but I feel like maybe you think differently about that.
Exactly. Thank you so much. It's really wonderful to come on this podcast and talk about these topics with you. I noticed maybe 10 years ago when I first started my job at Stanford working on a program on American democracy that whenever we would talk to reform organizations or people who were active in politics, there was a strong anti-party sentiment, even among people who are probably reliable voters for one party or the other. And this is completely counter to basically an academic consensus showing that strong parties are critical to democracy. So I wanted to just briefly explain why. It's really impossible to think of the history of representative democracy without parties. And if you go all the way back to when we had, monarchies with limited democracies, you had a legislature that was not popularly elected, but oftentimes was nonetheless grouped into little factions of men who had common interests with one another. As suffrage expanded and democratization started happening in the late 18th century, but especially throughout the 1800s, these factions needed a way to mobilize voters. Now, suffrage was by no means universal. Women couldn't vote, people of color couldn't vote, but non-property owning men, there were tons of them. And so the question became, how do you figure out what their interests are and how to mobilize them and how to convince them that what you're doing as an elected official is in their interest? And one of the ways that parties really worked was to subordinate individual interests to some kind of broader collective group identity. I shouldn't say identity, set of interests that is shared among the people bearing this party label. So that creation of representative organizations was really how the representative part of democracy could happen. But the second thing that parties did was to actually organize the machinery of elections themselves. You had no, election administration to speak of at the beginning of the democratic period. So really it was party agents who would go out and talk to people in the public. They would issue party pamphlets and brochures and bring people and, print ballots for them on election day. A lot of that has changed, but parties to this day still recruit candidates to run. They still organize a lot of the way elections happen. So we see parties still running elections, which is how, democracy ultimately works. And then the final thing that parties did, and this is what I think has been lost in a lot of our contemporary politics, is they integrated and socialized voters into politics itself. Sometimes they did this through civic spaces, basically, like local party organizations where people could come together and talk about not even politics, but just various shared interests. But they also did this by creating coalitions and spaces for deliberation, where people who didn't necessarily agree could nonetheless talk about ways to solve problems. And parties did this locally. They ultimately did it nationally. And partisanship, therefore, became a way that you could have a stable political identity and a very consistent way to engage in politics, both during elections and between elections. So it was a way to structure basically citizenship.
That is so interesting because I think a lot of people feel like the parties are not for them, but you're essentially saying that they were essentially like the medium through which regular people could participate in what government was doing, right?
Exactly. And it didn't mean that it was consistent. You had some places that were big countryside, rural areas where it's difficult to go from place to place and try to get a bunch of people together. Alternatively, in cities, you got the rise of big urban machines that often used bribes or they were really associated with a lot of political corruption. So it's not to say that the party was always this flourishing, pure political organ, but it was nonetheless kind of the only intermediary organization that created this link between citizens and their elected officials. And we even today have seen a lot of different types of political organization in history, including labor unions, social movements, different kind of civic associations and interest groups. But none of those have the joint task of both mobilizing citizens into a cause and also representing their interests in the legislature.
That is so fascinating because I feel like people don't think about it in that way, and parties have such a bad name to them, and even sometimes like bad, denotation or connotation or whatever in terms of people their sentiment toward it, right? So in terms of how parties developed, how parties were created and the roles that they played in democracy, you talked about that. But what are some circumstances in history that have contributed to perhaps the cynicism that people have now toward parties, and like how they feel about them now?
That is a great question. And there are lots of different reasons for this moment we're in of anti-party sentiment. Part of it is kind of baked in. Even in George Washington's farewell address, he warned everyone against faction. The founders and the Federalist Papers were also really concerned about faction. There weren't really parties per se, but they were worried that if you created us versus them in politics, that it wouldn't necessarily go well. What they sort of didn't realize, and what the intervening history has shown, not just in the United States, but across the world, is that stable parties can organize collective identities and they can create the rules of the game for democracy itself to work. So when citizens know this party stands for this set of ideas, that party stands for another set of ideas, and parties can try to organize different people across classes or across differences, that's when you get the kinds of policies or coalitional compromises that can create legislative progress and big kinds of social policies and public policies that work for most citizens. Alternatively, when parties are weak, they basically become vehicles for individual power and individual candidates who seek to use a party as a means to win an election, often as a pretext to then either dismantle democracy or to not be interested at all in forging compromise or public policy. So these strong and stable parties are what has led to democratic consolidation in the past. Now, to get to your actual question, why has it weakened? We think of parties as doing a lot of different things, as I just said. And in the post-war period, you got a real nationalization of parties that was furthered by communications technology like radio and television, a real focus on, for example, presidential elections. And by the 70s, a relative weakening of state and local party organizations. The national parties were able to do things like professionalize. They invested a lot more in advertising, first direct mail advertising, and then later with new technologies of polling and sort of political strategy, political consulting. They could basically just sell different messages to voters, get to know what it is will resonate with different people, different members of their base or members of the electorate, and weaken the former robust integrative or representative mechanism of parties. Parties basically developed ways to win elections without really having to maintain relationships with their constituencies between elections or strong presence within communities to really understand what communities needed. Now, if we scoot up to the 90s, I think there's also a kind of a story that's woven into our broader economic system. We have a rise of neoliberal economics in the 1970s. By the 1990s, parties of the left, so for example, the Democratic Party here, led by Bill Clinton, but even in Western Europe as well, parties of the left were sort of reimagining themselves as parties that could capture majorities by basically moving a little bit to the right on economics, promising that through free trade and deregulation, we are going to get a lot of economic growth. They definitely catered a little bit more to the donor class. And at least in the United States, after 2000 and the Bipartisan Campaign Finance Reform Act, you got a decentralization of campaign finance that gave special interests and well-resourced interests more influence in politics. And that continues to this day after the Citizens United decision. So that was kind of a long and messy answer, but it's to say that we have these structural changes, more nationalized politics, more professionalized politics. And then we also have the dynamics of money in politics and ultimately who it is that the parties are responsive to.
No, not messy at all. And even her word, parties are very messy themselves, so it's okay.
It's true. Yeah.
But so one thing that you said that really struck me about the parties, essentially trying to create places where a lot of different people can find a lot of common ground, right? And I don't know if you have thoughts on this particularly, but it seems like it's incredibly imperative, particularly in America, for that to exist because we are a multiracial, multi-ethnic country. On top of that, we're very large geographically and very spread out, right? So, does that play a role too in terms of why parties are necessary in America in particular? Or I don't know if you had any comparisons for other countries, but I was curious if that played a role at all.
I think that there's definitely a set of academics who would tell you a story that when the United States became a truly multiracial democracy after the passage of the Civil and Voting Rights Acts, that you get the beginning of polarization. That's when you develop a much more coherent kind of conservative Republican Party, where the Southern Democrats who, eventually implemented Jim Crow laws and ruled in an authoritarian way in a racially segregated South, once they moved into the Republican Party, you started to get the beginnings of the racial homogeneity in the party we see today. Whereas the Democratic Party became the party of the many diverse interests racially, but also, this is also true outside the United States, of more women, and recognition of minorities, religious minorities, cultural minorities, people who have felt excluded and marginalized from politics. And as a result, that diversity within the left coalition can be harder to wrangle into a unified party. So some people would say that there are just some structural reasons why you've gotten a more fractured left and maybe a more conservative and homogenous right. But that said, we're seeing all of that upended today, where the right is itself deeply divided. The Republican Party has been challenged by the MAGA faction. And also across other advanced democracies, far right parties have been able to do very well and put pressure on the mainstream parties. So if you are going to create more common ground, whether it's on the left or on the right, it is definitely going to require doing, as you say, and understanding how different communities, what they sort of need and want from politics, and how you build a shared understanding and set of goals upon that. Because if you just let everything play out without broader organization, which is exactly what a party is supposed to provide, you'll just get a bunch of fractured interests who are often working at cross purposes. And that can be bad for the long-term stability of the party and for democracy itself.
Which really goes into the other point that you made a minute ago about how the parties began to, like you said, sell messages to voters in terms of what they wanted them to think about, versus, like you said, being the actual place in consensus of where people were ideologically. And so I'm wondering, going into my next question, which kind of takes a step back again, but so why do you find that, well, let me ask you this. Do you think our parties are strong now, or are they weak? And why are they strong, or why are they weak now?
That's a great question. I would say that so many academic conferences I go to get hung up on this question. So party strength has different dimensions. I think that for most people, party strength is whether or not a party is winning elections, and more importantly, capturing majorities. So a lot of times, if you read kind of horse race politics or the day after the election, a party is strong if it did really well in an election, and it's considered weak if it underperformed or if it lost seats, for example. On that metric, I think that our parties are kind of strong. And in fact, I think that our polarization, our polarized polity that we have today is in part because parties are pretty good at whipping votes in the legislature. they seem to be, completely at odds, so much so that they won't even compromise in Congress. And this is, therefore sowing a lot of distrust in the public. But because they are singularly unified under the goal of, capturing a majority, there's a world in which that is party strength. But if we think about this other dimension of parties as serving a representative function in which they're supposed to mobilize people into politics and socialize them, integrate them, and create these spaces for deliberation and coalitional work, I think that parties are weak on that dimension, and they have been for a long time. And if you are constantly able to win elections, but you don't necessarily have the trust or even just sort of the day-to-day kind of interaction with voters, then they're going to come to see you like a big power holder, the way that they often describe maybe big business or sort of big institutions that are far removed from their daily lives. Okay, those parties are just people who care about their own power and their own kind of elite status, and they don't work for people like me. And what's interesting in this era of polarization is it's not necessarily a product of the public being super polarized. Sure, you have loyal Republicans and loyal Democrats, but they often, if you just ask them about policy issues, there's a lot more areas of agreement than there are of disagreement. And also, there are just a lot of people who are becoming more alienated by the parties overall. More and more people describe themselves as independents. Those people are more cynical about politics and less likely to participate. And even among people who are partisan identifiers, they say they don't really like the parties. They're just going to keep picking this one over the other. And so, 70% of Americans oftentimes in polling say that democracy is in crisis. They may differ on why they think that, but there are really low levels of trust in all of our governing institutions, very low levels of trust in political parties. And that makes it very hard for people to ultimately connect to government.
This is so good. I'm over here taking notes because I'm also learning a lot. This is awesome.
Thanks,
so in terms of, I guess, and maybe this is teasing into your book. I don't know if it is or not, so we'll see. But in terms of how we can create solutions for the second part that you were talking about in terms of coalitions and trust, do you think that there are applications that could be made that would resolve some of these problems, and from your perspective?
This is kind of a cop-out answer because I feel like academics are good at describing a problem, but not at all good at providing the solutions, and we probably shouldn't. But so my dodge is to say that the solutions probably are very boring. They're like to get involved in politics, maybe not even partisan politics, but basically to find some problem in your neighborhood that you care about and work on it. Or maybe not even a problem, just something you like and you want to further that cause, something in the educational system or fixing the potholes or whatever it is, because involvement itself begins to teach people to contact elected officials, how to, go to a city hall meeting or a city meeting or things that probably are boring and a lot of people don't have the time to do. But if you care about things and you don't feel like something is being done, you can be the person who does them. I would say another thing that is also kind of boring is to not shy from being a partisan. Like if you mainly vote for Democrats or mainly vote for Republicans, but part of you just feels like you just hate the parties, you don't think so what? Just say you're a Democrat. You may not feel completely represented by Joe Biden, but you mainly vote for Democratic candidates. You think that that party has more to offer you than not. So call yourself a Democrat and work to further your, common interests that you have with some set of Democrats within the Democratic Party. There is a home for you, in other words. And I think that that's what's very difficult on the right now, is I've heard a lot of people in the center right say they feel politically homeless because the Republican Party is being very much taken over by an individual. And that's a problem. Like all of the little constituting parts of a party, including the local party, the state party, the affiliated, organizations like Republican Women or something like that, they all matter. So you can get involved in some part of them as a way to influence the party. But I think why my dodge is also to say what we should not, or things we should avoid. Right now, I think one of the most sort of alluring, but ultimately like not promising solutions in American politics and the reform space is to create a nonpartisan politics. There are a lot of people who seem to think that we can just find the better candidate or like just do a third party. Why can't we just do that? For better or worse, we have an electoral system that gives us two parties, and that is a different conversation. But if we wanted a third party, then we would need to focus on electoral institutions. We can't just create a third party out of thin air, put two compelling people at the top of that ticket, and expect it to change our politics. Just because our institutions happen to, we don't really give a lot of ability for third parties to succeed. And I think that this real support for nonpartisan primaries, for example, kind of neglects the history of primaries, which is that they were a way for voters to have a say in the candidate selection for the parties. They are explicitly party elections. They are not general elections that the state decides to run a few months before a general election. That's just costly and kind of pointless. I do think that we should probably have open instead of closed primaries, but we have, I think, a tendency to be a little bit naive and maybe ignorant that if we just got rid of the partisan label, we'd get rid of these annoying power holders and we could just find the smarter people. Again, I will just say people with common interests in politics will always come together. You can't wish away parties. No successful democracy has been able to. So if you are going to get parties or factional interests anyway, you might as well try to create long-term, lasting, successful parties by not being afraid to work within that rubric and by not trying to dilute their power through solutions that have, sometimes been tested but have never been successful.
That's so good. So a couple things from that. I'll start out with your point about not shying away from being a partisan, which I think is so compelling and important because, to your point, a lot of people in their disdain or even disgust for both parties, they decide that they don't want to be partisan at all. They want to be independents. But then you have all these people, as independent voters who may not be participating, like you said, in the primaries where you can, cultivate a better party on either side. And obviously some states have open primaries. I live in South Carolina and you go to the ballot box on primary election day. You just decide, which party's primary you want to vote in, which is great. In other states like Colorado, where independents or no party affiliates can vote in either primary as well. But asking a question here about perhaps your distinction between partisanship or even hyperpartisanship and polarization, because I feel like that's not something that is talked about often enough. And do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a hard question because we definitely usually collapse the two together, that people who are partisan must just be hyperpolarized. Partisanship is just, I won't even say loyalty, but basically like affiliation or membership in a party. And parties used to be some of the biggest membership organizations in places like Western Europe. And here in the United States, we didn't really have card carrying party membership. But sometimes, like in those machine cities that we talked about, being a member of a party did unlock access to politics or to certain benefits that otherwise it wouldn't have. So there's, a world in which it was just fine to be a partisan. It was not good or bad. And I think that to this day, we should think of partisanship as something that just describes how you participate in politics. You're not doing something more noble if you are non-partisan. And if we have goals that are partisan, that's also fine. That's just what politics is. The partisanship, though, that I think people feel so alienated by, and it's understandable, is since the 1990s, we've seen a real rise in partisan polarization. And what that means is the two parties used to be more closely aligned or able to find agreement on different policy areas, and then they've diverged. And we see that in their roll call votes in Congress, and we certainly see it in the way that they talk about the other party. Sometimes we even see it in their governing approaches. I think that there have been times when governing in the minority, for example, Mitch McConnell said that the goal of the Republicans in Congress was to make President Obama a one-term president. Okay, so that's, people hear that and they can be, some people will be fine with it, some people will be turned off because it's like, is that a governing strategy or not? So there's some amount of partisan polarization that does reflect hostility, antagonism, sort of like allergy to compromise that really turns off Americans. But hyperpartisanship, or in academic terms, affective polarization, is describing a kind of like teamsmanship in politics where you feel very loyal to a party as part of your social identity. You can often use that as a way to otherize also. So not only do you feel loyal to your party, but you feel very hostile towards the other party. And hyperpartisans may be very likely to do things like use a purity test when evaluating candidates and say that they'd rather not vote for someone who's in their party but doesn't agree with them. They'd rather just not vote for that person at all. And that's the kind of hyperpartisanship that kind of hyperpartisanship can be at odds with trying to strengthen parties through compromise, problem solving, et cetera. And Eitan Hirsch who I know has also been on your podcast, has a really good description of this as political hobbyism. People who do politics through social media likes, but don't really get involved. And for people who actually do tend to get more engaged in politics or work within a party itself, they may or may not be as hyperpartisan, but they at least are exposed to a way of doing politics that creates over time the kind of healthy partisan attachments that you would expect, rather than just the hobbyist levels of the affectively polarized.
I love that. And thinking about how partisanship is done well, sorry, let me back up. So you were talking before about how, when the parties come together and they do things that are, hindering compromise or working together, that can be more polarization. Have you found, even you talked about in the history of why we created a two-party system, obviously it was, not obviously, but it was more to, create some cohesion so that, things like the Civil Rights Act could pass in the future, in the 60s. But when we're thinking about partisanship that's done well, do you find any examples nowadays of where the parties are doing partisanship well, and how they can use that to build progress for not only the party but the country? And I guess how is good partisan politics built?
That's a great question. So, and I think an obvious answer is someone like Stacey Abrams in Georgia. I think that for a long time we've assumed that our geography determines our politics. And I grew up in the suburbs of Atlanta, so Newt Gingrich won my district when I was, in middle school or something. And people have just said, well, that area is always going to be red now. And it was for a really long time until very recently, when it turns out that by very careful and just boots on the ground organizing using the Democratic Party label, you can persuade people. And that state has then returned elections for Biden and 2 Democratic senators. I mean, it's pretty stunning. So now we see, Democrats having learned a lesson from her and going into other places that they considered strong Republican districts. And we found that where local party organizations are stronger, or where you at least field a candidate, you can peel off votes from the person of the opposite party who was expected to win. So there is some lesson here that just like a top-down approach of looking at what your electoral map is and guessing that you'll never be competitive in different places really neglects what we should have learned from many centuries of democracy, that if you just go talk to people, try to be convincing about what politics can do for them, it might resonate. But I think that another example of someone who's doing politics well, or party politics well, is Steve Bannon, unfortunately. I mean, I guess he's about to go to prison. But the neglect of local and state offices was by both parties, and that created a vacuum in local power. And we've seen, Steve Bannon has been very specific. He has websites about how Republican MAGA supporters should go find their local Republican office, file some paperwork. They can become the blah, blah, blah county Republican chair. And then use that to hire, to recruit volunteers for election administration and poll workers. And we've seen in states like Arizona and Wyoming, the state Republican Party is pretty out of step with the national party, but that's partly because they have been able to step into largely vacant offices and use that to then do things like strip sitting senators of their Republican Party label. So it's it requires, so the party building can happen, bottom up. It can also happen through a careful plan of where we're going to go. But I think that parties need to have more energy at the local level rather than doubling down on purely national strategies if they're going to expand the map and really try to appeal to people.
And that's exactly what I was going to ask you to maybe dive into a little bit more, because your point about, neglecting local and state party, even politics. What are some ways that you think that the more localized approach can start to infiltrate the national approach? This could be simply like, listening to people who are literally city council people, right? Like asking them about things that, their perspectives versus, obviously just taking, like you said, the Washington insider approach. But I guess like how can the national parties learn from the local parties, and is there a big enough distinction between the two at this point? Because we saw, we see very often how local, they'll say like this county party has made this statement about their views on this thing. And it's like, why does that even matter? Like, you're not even affected by this at all.
Right.
I don't know. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I think that at this point, they're kind of optimistic thoughts rather than grounded in a lot of evidence. I mean, I will say, so Sam Rosenfeld and Danny Schlotzman, who I think have also been on your podcast, just wrote a great book, The Hollow Parties, where they describe the kind of local and embedded parties of the past, which did lead to more factional politics at the national level. It's not going to be as clean and tidy of a national story if you have Montana Republicans versus Florida Republicans versus California Republicans. But you have at least a lot more to work with in terms of what builds a compelling success story. So I think it accomplishes two things. One is, if the listening can actually translate upwards, I think that what local parties and state parties can bring are issues that have resonated with local constituents that really get to the problems that those people want to see solved. So then you're developing a really explicit story about how government has worked in the interest of these people. So it's kind of, you're not only trying to enhance trust in the party's ability to do things, but also enhance trust in democracy, government, et cetera. But the second thing that it can do is get people involved in politics, establish a bench, and show, how the party can't necessarily like offer the same kinds of material incentives and inducements to candidates that it could in the past. But we see now that a lot of local candidates, especially ones who might be a little bit to the extremes of their party, can do really well soliciting donations from people outside their district just through social media. They don't need the organization of a party. So if you're still in local parties trying to get candidates involved who can get things done and who can work with other people and develop skills of leadership and such, they might be able to tell a more compelling story rather than just spending time sound bites on social media trying to, bring in donations. That's difficult because it's like going a little bit against the tide of like how politics maybe works today. But I do think that if you had more localized parties, more activity taking place with other community organizations, other civic groups, that there's at least some hope for that relationship between citizens and parties to be improved. I don't think it could hurt.
Yeah. And as we start to close it out, because I feel like I have been making you talk for a long time now, and I appreciate you.
It's super fun. No, I love your questions.
No, you're like, I mean, Liam and I both adore you and think you're wonderful. So thank you again for being here.
Gosh. But you guys are amazing in everything that you're doing, seriously. And that's the hard work.
You're sweet. You're sweet. Well, we need people like you to help us inform these things. So this might be very much a chicken and egg question, but going back to your point about candidates, do you find, and this is maybe even, just looking at Trump, do you find that candidates are creating the parties, whether strong or weak, or are parties creating the candidates? Because, in my view, I think the parties make the candidates on the Democratic side, and I think the candidates make the parties on the Republican side. And I don't know, like, is there a way to resolve that or find a balance there? Or I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
No, I mean, some of the trends we've already talked about, like professionalization and nationalization, have led to a candidate-centeredness in politics in general. And on some level, like there's just the effect of technology. I mean, Barack Obama ran what at the time was considered the biggest grassroots campaign, but the grassroots were like largely digital. And after he was elected, there was a big debate within the DNC and President Obama's team about what should happen to all those email addresses. Should they be the parties or should they belong to OFA? And I think that really points to this diverse set of these sort of cross pressures, right? A candidate wants to build up his or her own base of support. In the past, they basically had to use a party to do that. But now, given the sort of decentralization of our campaign finance network and the fact that a lot of times yelling about how bad parties are can win you some support, it can be hard to know which route to take. Now, I do think you're right that the Republican Party is going in a much more personalized direction than it ever has in the past. Like this level of sort of the Trumpian takeover of the party with Lara Trump as the head of the RNC and such, that is like a truly non-democratic, truly like sort of unprecedented in the United States way of using a party as an individual vehicle. And whereas on the Democratic side, there's still a sense that the candidate is someone who has had to work through the party and, make them capture support from different coalitional interests. What I will kind of link both of those things to is we do have a primary process for candidate selection in both parties. And that's exactly the one that Joe Biden is reminding people of right now in a moment when a lot of other Democrats are saying, could it be someone else? Well, it's July before a presidential election. Like we did have a process for selecting someone else. And that is also the process that in 2016 picked Donald Trump and did it again this year. So it's a tough call. Like I think that there are the parties themselves have become much more candidate centered. I think that you're right. There are some differences within the parties, especially in this current moment. And I also think that we have a history of how we've tried to make the parties more accessible to people. And sometimes people are still going to be unhappy with the result. So yeah, trying to balance out what the party can do by itself without voters versus when voters get the ultimate say. I think that's something that hasn't really been fully sorted out.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And just thinking about as we wrap up, like I just feel like you're giving a lot of hope to people to be more engaged, to help change the parties here, which I think is always really helpful and encouraging because to your point, we don't have a system that really permits a third party to succeed in America. And I think people feel helpless because they have seen, both parties and not liked what they've seen and felt like,
right.
Well, maybe if I had a third party, things would be better. But to your point, when people get engaged in the processes and, commit themselves to one party and find things that they like and build common ground, et cetera, then you can create the party that you want to be in versus just taking the party that you're given, right? So I'm really grateful for that point that you made. And our last question is the question that we ask everyone. And it's essentially, what advice would you give to listeners on activities that they can participate in that contribute to depolarization? It could be anything, could be big or small. And you kind of hit on some things tonight, today. I don't even know what time of day it is at this point. You hit on some things today.
I'm right there with you.
And just curious your thoughts on what people can do to help depolarize America.
I think these are cheesy recommendations, but the first one is to do something that makes you feel a little less powerless. So even if that's just write a letter or make a call to your local representative about some issue you care about, that can make you feel like, okay, we're probably not going to get like this, massive climate change legislation, for example. Although we've gotten pretty good climate change legislation recently, but you may not get what you want, but the mere fact that you are reaching out to someone and saying your piece, I think can make you feel like, okay, something happened and it was because of me. And maybe build upon that. You can go to local, not necessarily a party meeting, but again, just connect with someone online, a cause or a group that you support. And it's not just like you Venmo them $5, but, have a human conversation. The second recommendation, and I find this very hard to do sometimes, given the kind of geographic and residential segregation we have, is to talk to someone who you think thinks very differently than you. And I don't say that because, I'm not necessarily like the kind of person who thinks that we'll depolarize by like finding all of our common ground and bridging past all of our differences. These differences exist for a reason. They are substantive and they are important. That said, I find that it's often very easy to lean into caricatures of what people who are different than you think. And when you talk to them, you at least gain a better understanding and a reminder of what the stakes are here. Like there are areas of commonality that you will find. You will learn to respect where people are coming from. And it's just a useful reminder that like politics is not about life and death necessarily. We are all trying to just lay the groundwork for a better America. And so, I want to do it in certain ways probably that are different from how other people want to, but it's really worth understanding where they're coming from so that I don't fall into those same little traps of like, it's all so different, we can never, ever repair it.
100%. We have to understand people, at least where they're coming from.
Yeah, exactly.
Tell you on that. Amazing. Well, this was the best conversation, Didi. I so appreciate you. Thank you.
Yeah, I had so much fun, Lauren. Thank you so much. And I really appreciate it. And best of luck with everything that you all are doing. It's really important.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Didi. I appreciate you.
Thanks, Lauren. Bye.